Welcome to the History Nerd Nerd Podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Pulitzer Prize winner Caroline Fraser, Murderland. This book is so many different things. I would need 10 minutes to just introduce you to every single piece. It's true crime. There's actually architecture and engineering in here. I know that does make sense, but trust me, it does. Caroline did not win the Pulitzer by mistake, people. This is a fantastic book. When somebody says, what's one of your favorites of 2025, I guarantee this one is going to be it. I think I've talked it up enough. How about I shut up? Let's talk to Caroline. And here we are with author Caroline Fraser, Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. Caroline, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I like to ask this question for every Pulitzer winner. I know you don't find out until you win it, but when you found out you won the Pulitzer Prize, how big was that party? Did you get a bunch of kegs? Were you lighting stuff on fire? Like, how'd it go?
No, there were no kegs or fires, but yes, we did celebrate, and it was great. I mean, I was quite shocked at the news. You know, it came as a huge surprise. It was wonderful.
Now, I venture to say that this is a slightly different type of book from that one. Where did the kernel of this come from? Because this book is everything. It's true crime. It's a little bit autobiography. We've got geology. We've got engineering. It's a whole bunch of different things. Where did it start for you, the idea of this book?
Well, I think the kernel of it, began in the 1970s when I was living in the Northwest and experiencing, hearing the news about some of the things that I describe, especially the news about Ted Bundy, or as he was known before anybody even knew who he was, just Ted. And in the book, I reprint a poem that I wrote when I was in high school, which is actually about a serial killer. And I think that reflects how creeped out I was and also just intrigued by, just kind of searching for an explanation of what was happening at that time. And so I think that's kind of the origin story of the idea. And I had thought over the years of maybe writing something about it and had actually written some small passages that are in the book, but didn't really pull it together until I found out about the history of the smelter in Tacoma, where many, several of these serial killers grew up.
Now, it also turned into what you lovingly call a crazy wall. It so encapsulates the book because I think for anybody who's going to pick it up after this, there's so much going on. But you start off with the idea of the crazy wall, and it really brought everything together in my head. Tell me about the crazy wall. What is it?
Yeah, the crazy wall, I mean, if you have watched television in the last 30 years or something, you've probably seen a crazy wall because it's just used indiscriminately in virtually every crime show, fictional crime show, True Detective, I think I mentioned, Fargo, any show that involves the police looking for a murderer, or even a show like Sherlock has essentially a crazy wall. And it's just basically any kind of wall, or sometimes it's the floor, and it's a surface where the character, the detective, whoever, puts up a whole lot of photographs and maps and clues, people's names, trying to make sense of a crime kind of in the middle of the investigation. And it's a visual that nobody seems to be able to resist because it just encapsulates this kind of, overwhelming situation where you've got too many clues, too much information, and you're trying to make sense of it.
Because I think serial killers, Ted Bundy, I think that's easy for everybody. The other aspects, I think, wonderfully, I should say, come out of nowhere. And especially what I find very funny is I've already told a bunch of people to read this book, one of which my friend Keela. She was born in Tacoma, grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and was halfway through, and she goes, I didn't realize the vast majority of this. And I'm like, well, I think that means Caroline nailed this one. One of the ones that stuck out for me, because I knew nothing about this, some bridge construction is part of this. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What bridge are we talking about? How does it kind of matter?
Well, one of the things that was a big piece of infrastructure in my life and in the lives of everybody who grew up in Seattle or on Mercer Island. I mean, I grew up on Mercer Island, which is a fairly, well-to-do suburb of Seattle. And it is connected to Seattle by a floating bridge, which was built in the 1940s as part of the New Deal and doing these big infrastructure projects as part of the run-up to World War II, essentially, and creating these ties, to communities so that people could get back and forth in a efficient manner. And the floating bridge was kind of a seventh wonder of the world type thing because there had never been something like it before. And so it was celebrated quite a bit and used heavily. But the flaw in the design of the bridge was this mechanism that they included, which was always called the bulge. Because the bridge sort of expanded, kind of like, think of a snake swallowing large prey, and they develop a kind of bulge in their skin. And this mechanism was to open the bridge to allow traffic across Lake Washington. And the problem with the bulge was that it caused all these accidents. So it was kind of an inconvenient and in many cases, much worse than inconvenient, fatal flaw in the construction of the bridge. And so the reason that I, made the bridge into a kind of a sort of malevolent character in the book was to emphasize how there were all these things like, the bridge and the, lead smelter in Tacoma that did things to the population that were really unacceptable, that were verging on criminal or should have been criminal. And yet they were completely accepted and normalized. And so I think the bridge is another example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the smelter, which in Tacoma, which polluted this huge area of Puget Sound and perhaps influenced some of the crime that was happening.
And speaking of some of the crime, so you say this in the book, growing up, it wasn't just that Ted Bundy was around. How many that we know of serial killers were kind of active during this time frame that you cover in the book?
The specific period that I'm talking about in terms of how many there were is around 1974, 75, when there were at least a half a dozen serial killers who were operating in Washington state. And that strikes me as a fairly significant number, given that the population of Washington state wasn't that high then. And I think it also just expands your idea of what was happening in the Pacific Northwest, because we tend to think only of Ted Bundy in this regard, or maybe Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, but we're not aware of a lot of these other figures who were active at the time as well.
It is truly kind of, to use a term again, crazy, reading that and just realizing, because first of all, if you have one serial killer living near you, that's too many. But to have that many, and you're kind of like, I don't want to go out of the house. But how well was it known back then that all of these people were active? Were the authorities actually making people well aware of them? Like, Ted was a huge name, but you have other ones in here that I've never heard of before in my life, and I read a lot of true crime.
Well, I think you have to remember that in the 1970s, this whole phenomenon was so new, and the police themselves did not really understand the reach of it. They didn't know how to investigate these kinds of crimes. And so the situation that unfolded, for example, with Bundy was terribly shocking, I think, even to the detectives who were investigating it. I mean, they didn't even know how to marshal the resources that they needed or to establish the kind of relationships between different police departments in different parts of the state and outside of the state, because this was so new to them, that just the idea that somebody could be killing some people in Washington state, but at the same time killing people in Oregon and maybe California and maybe Idaho. I mean, that was just unheard of, really, to them. And so I think the general public had no conception, really, of what was happening.
Is this why Bundy has seemingly such an outsized kind of influence when it comes to true crime? Like, I think at a certain point, it feels kind of gross how much attention he still gets. I think you really do a great job in this, because there is nothing really redeemable about him as a person, the way you tell his story. But he's in a lot of books. He's in a lot of shows. Is it because he was kind of almost the archetype? Why does he get so much press, I guess?
Well, I think that is part of it. I think because he was one of the first of these guys to come to public attention. And then that phenomenon was really given additional power by virtue of Ann Rule's book, The Stranger Beside Me, which I think established him as a kind of, national and international figure. So I think all those things played into it. But I also think he was adopted, if you will, by all these fiction writers, and as an inspiration, the Robert Harris novels, the Hannibal Lecter and so forth. The idea of the serial killer as this maniacal genius who is smarter than everybody else, and who can operate without ever getting caught, or even if he gets caught, he can outwit people and escape. And obviously Ted's escapes factored into that as well. To my mind, when I came to do this, I really wanted to kind of revise the image, or by looking at the reality of Ted Bundy against the history that he was part of. I wanted to tell the real story. He had been made into sort of a mythic figure, an iconic figure, very exaggerated in some ways, and I just wanted to kind of bring him back to earth.
And I love how you did it. You did it with the other people that you talk about as well, the other serial killers, which is just, as opposed to being these geniuses that other people make them out to be, they're not necessarily dumb, but their actions are kind of driven by this almost biological need. And it's not because they're planning everything out, it's because their heads feel like they're going to explode unless they do something. And then, like you said, you add in the fact that the police just really haven't seen something like this before, which kind of leads into everything that we're talking about, which is the lead crime hypothesis for true crime nerds. You've heard about it before. Kind of what is it? You've already mentioned the smelters in the area. What is this hypothesis, and what does kind of it mean?
Well, the hypothesis came about because in the United States, we had the worst rise in crime, the highest rise in the 1970s and 80s up till the early 90s. And then for some reason, the crime rate just falls off a cliff. It goes down quite sharply. And so a number of alert scientists looked at that graph, looked at the rise in crime and then the falling off of crime. And they also looked at another set of data points, which was the rise of lead in the atmosphere, which was mainly caused by leaded gas, the sale of leaded gas, which really explodes after World War II. I mean, it's around leaded gas since the 1920s, but when you think about how not that many people had cars then, or drove cars, or commuted in the distances that they do now, that rate of fuel use, leaded fuel, also rises quite sharply in the 1970s and 80s. And then leaded fuel is removed with the rise of the EPA, and they recognized the dangers of this. Of course, it had been recognized for many, many decades, but they finally decided to do something about it. And leaded gas is withdrawn from sale by around, 1986 and fully removed by the 90s. And so those two graphs, the rise of crime and the rise in the use of leaded fuel, look very, very similar. And so people said, maybe there's something there. And there are alternative theories. There are theories that suggest that the improvement in policing in terms of dealing with serial killers and the heavy investment in police resources may have also had something to do with it. There's an argument in the book Freakonomics about abortion, which suggests that, the availability of legal abortion may have had something to do with it. But the lead crime hypothesis to me is very intriguing because I think it is now posited that, something between 20 and 50% of that rise in crime could be related to lead in our atmosphere.
And I like how the way you presented that too, because the first time I bring it up to people who haven't heard it, they're like, well, what about this or what about this? And I always say it doesn't explain everything. Otherwise, a good amount of Tacoma would be out whacking people as we speak. But there's such a strong correlation as far as numbers are concerned that you just kind of go, I'm not saying there's definitely something there, but something might be there. I think I should ask Caroline, just to clarify, you are not yourself a serial killer, even though you grew up near a smelter, right? Can you just confirm so we can just move on from that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Looking at that correlation, what I really appreciate about what you did in the book is you didn't make this a science book about numbers. It was more just, oh, hey, by the way, here's another serial killer, and this is where they grew up. And here's another one, this is where they grew up. You made it so human. Was that like a choice for you in the beginning where you're like, I don't want to get just into the numbers and just bore everybody to death. You want to make it more human?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that case that I mentioned at the very beginning, in which Ted Bundy is a strong suspect, the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl named Anne Marie Burr in Tacoma in 1961, that had a lot of meaning to me because I was born in 1961, and just the idea that this was the kind of thing that was happening at that time, to me, was just a really evocative. It had just a feeling of this is kind of the beginning of what is going to be happening over the next few decades. And it's such a tragic, story because not only did she disappear, but nobody's ever really solved it. Nobody really knows what happened. Although Ted Bundy, for his part, gave a kind of veiled confession of it much later in his life in the 1980s. And so I think we kind of know what probably happened. But to me, it was just very suggestive of the kind of things that were going to be happening in the 60s and the 70s. And just looking at the childhoods of these guys, the three that I mentioned at the beginning, Charles Manson, who spent some significant time on McNeil Island, the prison just outside of Tacoma, Anne Bundy, and Gary Ridgway, just suggests to me the kind of tragic trajectory that we were on.
And you add some autobiographical portions to this. What was your choice there? It almost felt like to me like it was almost relieving a pressure valve, putting in somebody who has just said that she is not a serial killer, but showing what it's like to kind of live in this time, because it does get heavy. Hearing about Bundy, BTK, it gets heavy. It felt like that was almost you relieving the pressure for the reader. Is that what you were going for?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things, and that was definitely one of them. I mean, when I began writing about the serial killer activities, it's so disturbing and so heavy, as you say, that I just felt like I can't write just about this. I have to break it up a little bit with something that is a little bit lighter, but also, and this is, I think, the other main reason for the memoir material, to give people a sense of what it was like to be alive then, because There are now lots of people, who weren't around at that time, who don't remember the 1970s, who don't remember the very different ways that girls were socialized at that time, the way women were treated. The misogyny in that era certainly has not been eradicated, but it's very different now. It was much more overt in the 1970s. And I wanted to show the aspects of that work themselves out in family life. Some of the anecdotes that I was telling about my family involved the suggestions about domestic violence, which I think plays a real big role in this period, and also in developing serial killers. I think a lot of serial killers, aside from lead, may have been exposed to physical or sexual abuse. I also bring in the Christian Science church in which I was raised. To me, that institution is always associated in my mind with the 1970s because of Nixon. Nixon had a few Christian Scientists working with him. Haldeman and Ehrlichman, who both went to jail for their roles in Watergate, were both Christian Scientists. So that whole zeitgeist, the rise of the power of the president, the power of institutions, the power of corporations, that to me is all associated with the 1970s. So I wanted to give a picture of that.
As an author, how do you look out for your own mental health when writing something like this? Did you have a timer where you're like, I got to go for a walk? Or how did you keep yourself sane when you're this deep into just some terrible stuff?
Yeah, I guess I think of it as part of the job because, journalists of all kinds are exposed to describing really terrible things. If it's not murder, it's war, it's genocide, it's mass plague or mass illness, or, there's so many things that journalists or reporters write about that can be really overwhelming. So yeah, you do have to just take a break sometimes.
And then some of especially the pollutants, you had mentioned the smelters, and it's just strange, talking about human emotion and how you respond to them. There's a part where a smelter is being taken down, right? And we know nowadays that it's a good idea to not live downwind of a smelter. But one of them came down and the community was actually kind of sad about it and almost kind of devastated that it was coming down. Can you just kind of explain, what's that mindset? How would that be, especially now that we know so much more about pollution? Why would a community react like that?
Well, just for starters, I think you have to realize that these were very, very common once upon a time. In the earlier decades of the 1900s, I think most people lived within 10 miles of a smelter. They were so common in all the major cities, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Pittsburgh, certainly. So you were more likely than not. And if you lived near a smelter and if your family worked at them, smelters often had a very paternalistic relationship to their workers and had established kind of company towns around the smelter. And so you were reliant on that corporation basically for all your needs, for your schools and police and firemen, and they were providing services of every kind and were the paying, these were fairly well-paid jobs in some instances. And so people were very attached to that way of life. And they had been, I think, taught by the corporate culture itself to value what they were getting in terms of wages and services more than, to fear what they were also getting, which was lead and arsenic.
Well, luckily, the corporations the entire time were doing the right thing and being good citizens themselves and reading all the science and not running their own, perhaps slightly biased studies that found things that other scientists did, right? They were perfectly fine, and the corporations didn't do anything wrong around this time, right?
Well, that was certainly the image that they cultivated. And in the case of Asarco, which is a company I talk a lot about, the American Smelting and Refining Company, which was started by the Guggenheim family, there was no stone left unturned really by them in terms of trying to, control information about what they were doing. Now it seems insane, the kinds of arguments that they were making to these communities. They were basically telling them that arsenic is really not a problem. And if we're filling the air with arsenic particulates and lead particulates, that's not going to affect your health. And I mean, what do we know about arsenic? And lead, we have known since the days of the Greeks and the Romans that these are serious poisons, and exposure to them can make you crazy, especially lead. Lead is something that if you're exposed to it, especially as a child, it can make you irritable, angry, make you act out. There's a whole range of different behaviors that it can cause because it's affecting the development of your brain.
And it really came down to, for some of these corporations, it's so sick now to think about it, but it happens. Oh, well, if somebody gets sick, we'll have to pay them this in a lawsuit, but shutting down the smelter will be this much money. So we'll just handle the lawsuits as they come in. I mean, this isn't, we think they did it. Like, this was documented that these are just choices they made, right?
Yeah. I mean, they did these horrific kind of back of the napkin calculations about the value of a child's life. And they just figured, well, if we kill or maim or harm permanently the health of this many thousand children, we're still going to come out ahead, as long as we just go ahead with what we're doing, which, I mean, I'm talking about the case of what was called Uncle Bunker in Idaho, the Bunker Hill mining company, which had a number of smokestacks in this one valley. And they had a fire, so their pollutant controls were not working. And they just figured, well, let's just go ahead and fill the air with lead because the price of lead is so high that we can't stop what we're doing. So let's just go ahead and do it anyway.
Well, there's a lot for us to extrapolate from that, Caroline, but I'm going to let the listeners figure that one out for themselves. I'm going to move on to something else. If I could send you back in time so that you could actually interview one person from the book, who would it be? And I will say that this person, if needed, would be restrained while you were talking to them in case you're a little bit worried. Is there any one person that sticks out where you're like, I'd love to kind of get into that brain?
That's very tricky to answer because from what I've read of the transcripts, of some of these serial killers, some of them never talk at all, but others talk endlessly. I mean, Dennis Rader, the BTK killer from Wichita, has talked at great length about his crimes. Ted Bundy, obviously I think he would probably be at the top of anybody's list in terms of what we would like to know. But the problem with talking to these guys is that they often I think almost universally, they have no insight into what they've done, which is the part of the problem with portraying them as geniuses, because one thing they do not know is why they do what they do, and they also lie continuously. I mean, everything that comes out of their mouths is a lie. And so interviewing them, even though, in the last few days of his life, Bundy, for example, dropped the mask he dropped the insistence that he was innocent of everything. And he began confessing to his crimes. But we still do not know much of what he did. We don't know when he started killing. We don't know who his first victim was. We don't know who his father was. We don't know so much about what he did. And obviously you would want to, if you could go back in time and get those answers from somebody, you would want to do that. But I don't even think it's possible to do that because unless you had some miracle drug, truth serum, that, forced people to tell the truth, I still don't think you would get answers to a lot of those questions.
I do have one conspiracy theory about Ted Bundy. It might be completely off the wall, but I mean, you're a very successful author, so I'll just throw this at you. I know with Bundy in his last few days, he tried to blame so much of it on pornography growing up. And I honestly believe that he was joking, that he just wanted to think about, oh, I'm going to get people all spun up about this, and I'm going to be dead, and they're never going to be able to figure it out. And I feel like that he was closing out with just screwing with people because, as you were just talking about, like, there was never truth to him. It was all kind of lies. Am I crazy? Do you think I could talk you into that one?
Oh, I definitely think that he had an agenda in trying to make people think that was part of the reason why he did these things, or even most of the reason. I think one of the reasons why he had, real motivation for not confessing before, because he still hoped to get some kind of, last minute reprieve of some kind through the legal system. And if he confessed, that wasn't going to happen. But I think he also was exquisitely kind of sensitive in a strange way to people's impressions of him. He wanted to maintain the idea that he was innocent. And so once that had fallen away, he was very drawn, I think, to this whole, like, oh, I did it because I was exposed to porn. Well, that kind of lets him off the hook, right? And just played into this evangelical Christian agenda of trying to say that pornography is a great sin and can cause people to murder other people, which I think is probably a stretch, but.
Well, he didn't bring up lead, that's for sure. I love asking authors this, Caroline. Being an author, I know you're constantly researching, doing all of this. Do you get to read any nonfiction or history for fun? Do you have any favorite authors? Or do you have any author friends with books coming out and you want to do a plug for them?
Oh, well, I mean, yes, there are many, many writers who I love. I mean, Greg Grandin just has a new American history book coming out, and I love his work. He's really great. Another true crime writer, Elon Green, who you may have heard of, he wrote a book that I talked a little bit about in a review a few years ago called Last Call, but he's now got a new book out called The Man Nobody Killed, which I haven't read yet. I have a copy of it. I'm hoping to get to that. Yeah, there are so many. I mean, there are great essayists, and Rebecca Solnit, I'm very fond of her essays, and a lot of others. Hilary Mantel is a big favorite of mine. She's mainly associated with fiction, but wrote a lot of nonfiction essays that are super influential, I think, and well worth reading. There's almost too many to think
Don't I know it? I trust me, I know. So listen, last question for you, Caroline. There are people who are kind of like, hey, nonfiction's not my thing. I had to take history in high school. It was boring. I don't want to read a book. Or true crime. It's like true crime is just true crime. Like that's just glorifying murder and all that stuff. Now, you and I both know these poor misguided souls are missing out. If I sat one of them in front of you and they said, why should I read Murderland? What would you say?
Oh, I think history is one of the most fascinating genres of nonfiction, and that it explains us to ourselves. If we don't know things about our past, then we're just floundering. And I see this a lot, contemporary discourse and political rhetoric. If you don't know some of the major events of our past, whether it's the Revolutionary War or the Civil War or the Great Depression, if you don't know the facts behind those events, you can be misled in all kinds of different ways. And I'll also say that my previous book, Prairie Fires, which is a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder, I think that much of what people responded to in that book was about the history that woman represented, the history that she lived through, because she lived from the covered wagon days through the Dust Bowl and the New Deal and the Depression. And those things were all happening when she wrote The Little House on the Prairie. So those things feed into her work and were really a part of her life. And I think people really responded to the history in that book. And I hope they respond as well to the history in Murderland, because I think seeing these serial killers in the context of their time, how they began, where they grew up, why they may have flourished when they did in the 70s and 80s. Even if you may or may not buy the lead crime hypothesis, but I think it's really well worth knowing about it, if nothing else, because the lead didn't go away. Unless it was actively removed, as was the case in some of those neighborhoods in Tacoma, it's still there. People are talking about reopening some of these mines, like the mines in Bunker Hill in Idaho. That's an active thing that's ongoing. So lead is always out there, kind of waiting to get us. I don't think it makes everybody a serial killer. But when you think about what it actually can do to people, I think you want to know about that. I think it's better to know than to not know.
And Murderland is the perfect way to learn about it. Caroline, thank you so much. Love the book. Thank you for coming to talk about it.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Caroline, thank you so much. Murderland. People are going to be talking about this one. Trust me. Go out, get it, make sure you've read it before they start talking about it. You want to go into this bad boy fresh. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.